Okay, the topic today for Faith Mysteries is blind faith. In other words, sometimes Christians are ridiculed for believing Jesus, and people will say, well, they have a blind faith. They don't think through why they believe what they believe. They just believe it because someone has told them to. And we're going to explore that today. Okay, again, so our topic is blind faith. Do Christians believe in Jesus solely because he tells them to, or because someone in authority has told them to believe that? Do they not put any thought to it in at all? Is it not based on any facts or evidence? That's going to be our question. So my answer, as you might guess, is no. Um, Christians that many of them might first believe without any kind of proof at all, and they'll follow Jesus and just see where it leads to see if there's some proof that solidifies their faith. And I just want to tell you that this is not an unreasonable thing to do necessarily, and it is not that different from what science and mathematics do. And I'll get to that at the end. That may sound strange to you, but it's actually very true. Let me give you some examples of people's faith, though, from the Bible, and I do not think anyone would call these people having blind faith. Here's an example. Look at Peter. His faith was shifting constantly. At first, he followed Jesus simply because his brother Andrew said, "You got to see this guy. He's the Messiah." And Peter started to follow him and listen to his teachings, saw miracles, lived life with Jesus. And as he gathered more evidence about Jesus, he came to some conclusions. He said Jesus was the Son of God. He said Jesus had the words of eternal life. No one else would have that but him. But there are also times where his faith was shaken. And out of fear, he abandoned Jesus, only to be reunited with him later after Jesus' resurrection. Take a look at Thomas. There's a perfect example of someone who did not have blind faith. Thomas required proof. He said, Jesus, I'm not going to believe in you unless you show me this, this, or this. The mark in your side, the nail prints in your hands. And Jesus did give him that. But my point is, it was not a blind faith. You look at Paul, who said, if we believe in Jesus, but it can be shown that he didn't rise from the dead, our faith is in vain. So definitely Paul did not have a blind faith and didn't want us to have a blind faith. As for me personally, I grew up Christian. My parents were Christian. They had a lot to do with forming my faith originally. So you could say maybe as a young child or young boy, I had a blind faith. But as I grew older, I questioned things. I researched things. I read the Bible. I looked at how Jesus lived his life. I looked at his miracles, looked at the prophecies surrounding him. And I think my faith is very strong now, and I would not call it a blind faith at all. But I wouldn't say that I have all the answers either. I've said that on every one of these videos. I don't have all the answers, just where I'm at in my faith walk. And to say that we are uncertain about things, I don't think that's a bad thing. It just means that we don't have all the answers to all the questions. But we know that God does, and we just trust that if we continue to follow him, that someday perhaps we have to wait till we get to heaven, we'll have all those questions answered. I do want to tell you though that God does not want us to have a blind faith. You might say, what? Huh? Doesn't he want us to have faith? Well, yeah, he wants us to have faith, but not a blind faith. Think about it for a minute. If you look at all the prophecies in the Bible about Jesus' birth, his life, death, resurrection, they're in the Old Testament. They're repeated quite often in the New Testament, in the Gospels. Why would the Gospel writers put that in there if they wanted us to have blind faith? The whole point of those prophecies is to show some kind of evidence or proof that these things were in the making from the beginning. Why did God have Jesus perform miracles? that was done so that you wouldn't have a blind faith, so that you would see the deity of God at work in him. They were signs that he had been sent from heaven. Okay, so God doesn't want us to have a blind faith, but we do have faith, and we don't have all the answers. We're following him on this path. Does that mean that science has a better way of thinking? And here's the problem with that. Can science have more certainty about things than Christianity or religion? Well, yes, but it's because they're studying different things. So how does science get certainty about things? It gets it by repeatable experiments, right? So just think of the example you learned in high school about combustion. So like if you remember, like if you take paper and you put it in the presence of oxygen, raise the temperature to 451 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't remember that's the exact number, but it's some number, and you will see combustion occur. So then you repeat the experiment over and over and over again. And then you start changing a little bit to see what happens. So like you remove the oxygen and see if it still works. Or you put the oxygen back in and put in something that's not a hydrocarbon and see what happens. Or you lower the temperature or raise the temperature or whatever. And over a certain period of time, you're going to come to the conclusion that what was once a hypothesis now becomes a theory with a very high level of certainty. Not complete certainty, but a very high level of certainty. So because science is able to repeat experiments and visually see that when we do this over and over again, the exact same thing happens, yeah, it's going to have a higher level of certainty about things. It's not just observation, but it's observation with repeatability. So the way the scientific method works, if you remember, you make a hypothesis, and it could be you're making this because you've seen it happen before, and you just want to write it down. Then you set up an experiment, you perform it, you collect your data, you observe it, did it verify or disprove the hypothesis, and you just keep repeating it. And so you do get a fair level of certainty on things when you use science. But here's the problem trying to compare science and religion. If I have a belief in Jesus, he only lived his life one time. It's not a repeatable experiment. It's a historical event. A person living their life is a historical thing. So it's not a videotape. I can't show you what happened. We have a record of what happened, and people will question that record or whatever, but it's not in the realm of repeatable experiments. So just solely on the basis of that, will science have more certainty about things? Yes, but it's because it's a different venue of things that are being studied. However, even though science can have certainty about things, there are times when it gets it wrong. So just like, here's an example. In the 1860s, this was after Darwin had written the theory of evolution. So I'm not talking about theory of evolution right now. There's a whole different video that I might go into. But Darwin came up with something called the pangenesis theory. So he developed a hypothesis that by observation, that the way traits are passed from parents to a child is that you have one trait here from one parent and one trait from the other, and that you pour them like paint. And like if you have black and white paint, you pour them, and then you get this continuously distributed variation in the offspring. We know today that's completely false. In 1953, I think it was, when DNA was discovered, we know it's not a continuous mixing of traits, that it's a discrete combination of traits. In the simplest possible examples, you have one gene from each parent. A gene is a collection of nucleotides on the DNA molecule that code for a specific trait. You get one from each parent, and in the simplest case, there's 4 possible outcomes. You may remember from high school biology, you have like capital A, capital A, capital A, small a, small a, small a, small a, capital A. And depending on which one of those 4 things you get, you will get a specific trait. You can have, people thought for a long time that if you had, a parent with black skin, a parent with white skin, that you would have a combination of those two. And sometimes that happens. But you can have it where 2 white people will give birth to a black skinned child. It happens. It all depends on the history of the genes that they've collected from their parents and their parents and their parents. So it's a discrete combination of outcomes, not a continuous mixing. And so that theory of Darwin's has been disproven. I'm not saying his theory of evolution has been disproven. That's something else. But pangenesis theory has been disproven. And that was held in high regard for about 100 years. Okay? And there's many, many other examples where science has gotten things wrong. So you might think, well, what about mathematics? Isn't there a level of certainty there? And the answer is, it's a greater level of certainty than you can have in science, but there's still some uncertainty to it. You probably find that hard to believe. So let me just give you just a real quick example. You guys remember from your high school geometry, the Pythagorean theorem. So you got a right triangle, and you've got these two legs, and they form a right angle, and then there's a third side called the hypotenuse. If you take a squared, a the length of one leg, b squared, b the length of the other leg, and add those together, you will get the square of that hypotenuse. It's called the Pythagorean theorem. Don't leave yet. It gets more interesting. Now here's the thing. When did we know the Pythagorean theorem was true? Pythagoras lived about 500 BC. But that theorem, or that truthfulness of that statement, a squared plus b squared equals c squared for a right triangle, had been known for centuries before then, just hadn't been proven, and didn't get proven analytically with more rigorous mathematics until a few centuries ago. My point is, in that particular example, there are times when there have been mathematicians in the past that quote unquote knew something was true but hadn't proved it. And you might think, well, today that no longer happens, right? Today everything is either proven in mathematics to be true or false. And this is going to blow your mind. That's not the case. In 1931, a guy named, and I may not be pronouncing his name right, is Godel, German with an umlaut on the O, Gödel, some people say, proved that there are some things in a sufficiently complex mathematical system, there are some things that are undecidable, meaning they could appear to be true, but you'll never be able to prove it. They could appear to be false, but you may never be able to prove it to be false. Since his time, there have been things that people thought fell into the undecidable category. And then they found out later they could actually prove them. And then there's other things people are just surely convinced can't be proven, but they feel they're true in their heart. For example, Goldbach's conjecture says that every even integer greater than 4, sum of two prime numbers. So you think about it, 6, 3 plus 3, both prime. 8, 5 plus 3, both prime. 10, 7 plus 3, both prime. Okay. 12, 7 plus 5, both prime. And you might think, well, that's obvious. Any even number could be two odd prime numbers, or two prime numbers added together. No one's been able to prove that's true. Everybody believes in their heart that's true, but nobody can prove it. I just think that's very interesting. Now, I kind of want to summarize things here. Do Christians have a blind faith? I don't think so. Do scientists have a blind faith? I don't think so. Do mathematicians have a blind faith? I don't think so. But it's interesting. They all operate in exactly the same way. What do I mean by that? Well, you take a look at the disciples. They followed Jesus, and as they followed him because they thought maybe he was the Messiah. But as they followed him, they gathered more and more evidence to corroborate what they believed. And that's how my life has been too. Take a look at scientists. They think something's true. They make a hypothesis, meaning I believe it's true, and then they go out and gather evidence to try to prove that it's true. Take a look at mathematicians. They've got axioms, they got undefined terms. They make statements that they think are true. Then they go out and try to collect mathematical evidence to prove that it's true. And all three of these situations, sometimes you never get to prove it. You're just never going to know. So there's really not that much difference. And I'm discussed this in another video, but if you just look about the existence of the universe, Christians believe that God created it. Many scientists believe that God didn't create it. Well, where did it come from? Science can't prove that. You can't prove that matter comes from nothing. The other alternative is that matter is eternal. Nobody can prove any of those three things. God created the universe. Matter came out of nowhere, or matter has always been here. No one can prove any of those things, but we're here. Matter is here. It happened, right? We just don't know how it happened. So, do Christians have faith that God created the universe? Yes. Do scientists have faith that the universe came into existence? You got to say yes, because you can't prove it. And there's a lot of things like that I'll get into some future videos. Sorry this went so long, but I didn't know any other way to do it. And besides, I like to talk a lot. Hope you enjoyed it. Love you guys. If I made some mistakes, if you want to add something, just put it in the comments. Have a great week.